Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Glass. I'm a cultural anthropologist on the faculty here at Bard Graduate Center and a member of the steering committee of the Cultures of Conservation initiative. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to take a moment to situate Indigenous concerns within the larger project. And before I do that, I would like to echo Dean Miller's words of acknowledgement from last night of the Lenape and all of the other Indigenous people of the region who have long gathered here in Mannahatta to make livings and to make lives. From the start of our initiative, it was important that the pluralization of cultures in the project title should signal the topical breadth of our approach. At the most consistent level, this has entailed bridging the culture of academia and the culture of the museum through close attention to the material properties of objects as a means toward both research and conservation. But we also wanted to stress, and continue to stress, that diverse peoples of the world bring their own cultural values and orientations to the material realm, their own fundamental notions of what the object is and isn't, what its proper relationship to persons might be, what factors might contribute to protocols surrounding its preservation, if indeed it ought to be preserved at all. And here you can see a sample of the events we've had in the first phase of our initiative, most available to stream on our website. It was with this foundation that I attended the talk last fall by Wolfgang Schäffner, who we heard from this morning. After a fascinating excursion through the active chemical and biological properties of certain matters and materials, as we heard, both I and a visiting research fellow at the time, Beth Piatot, who is Nez Perce and a professor of Native American Studies, raised the striking parallels between the scientific perspectives on offer and the philosophies of many indigenous people, for whom many matters and materials were never static in the first place. This recognition immediately raised a few questions for us. This is the kind of origin story of the Indigenous Ontologies Working Group. What are we really talking about? A question that's been raised already today. Molecules in motion, visible under a microscope or some other tool, or the capacity of objects to act as effective agents in the world, whether they are themselves animate or are capable of containing, temporarily or permanently, animating presences. Should we even be referring to them as objects? Many indigenous people reject this term as itself enacting a limited Western dualism, instead referring to treasured items as subjects, as beings, as belongings, as medicine, as ancestors, or foregoing European languages altogether and simply calling them tluque, atu, tonga. What do we, as scholars, curators, and conservators, do with museum collections that need to be fed, talked to, or cleansed with purifying smoke? To what and to whom do we imagine the matter of things being intrinsically related? Atomic components, raw materials, completed objects or subjects? Indigenous value systems often insist that these levels or scales be kept in discrete and direct and active relationship to one another, to human makers and users and custodians, past, present, and future, and to other than human beings, both terrestrial and celestial. When we talk about conserving active matter, what is it we are concerned to preserve, why, and for whom? The historical object in something like its original authentic state, something we just heard about, the raw matter or materials from which it was made, knowledge of that origin, identity, and embedded place in an ever-expanding nexus of genealogical relations, the very conditions for making, using, and caring for similar things in the future, currently threatened by ecological disaster. Finally, a quick and necessary, but only preliminary, note on terminology. The term indigenous ontologies has a certain currency at the moment in various fields of academia, where it is deployed to refer to more or less specific aspects of what we might call, in an outmoded language, native worldview. There is, in my estimation, a weak use of this term, which substitutes fancy-sounding jargon for what is essentially culture at its most holistic level. That is, the totality of beliefs and practices that constitute a population with a discrete sense of itself as a people. This most general use is unhelpful, as it refers to nothing in particular. At the other end of the spectrum is what I call a strong version of the term that purports to designate completely foreign and ultimately incommensurate systems of perception and cognition, which deny translatability into Western European ways of being and knowing. For some users of the term in this sense, the resistance to humanistic translation supports a critique of colonialism and its institutions of epistemic violence, surveillance, and containment, the museum, first and foremost, for the realm of material culture that interests us here. While an important political critique, I find this use of the term overextended, ahistorical, and overly essentializing. For the purpose of this project, we use the term ontologies in a kind of intermediate and more colloquial sense to refer to culture-specific theories of being. And I suppose we could duke this out with the philosophers over dinner. According to originating communities, what are the items in museum collections, fundamentally? What are their essential natures as certain kinds of beings in direct and persistent relation with other kinds of beings, be these objects, persons, or other than human agents, as well as in relation to specific knowledges, something we might gloss as cultural epistemologies. In the realm of material science, how can we move from concerns about inherent vice and the prevention of decay to recognition for, if not restoration of, the intrinsic capacity for growth and transformation? The ultimate goal of our working group over the next 5 years will be to examine the ramifications for conservation work, as well as exhibition practice, that follow from taking seriously indigenous ontologies of the object as an assemblage of active matter and persistent relations. And in a way, I think what I'm proposing is that we take the Cartesian notion of extended matter and extend it further into a universe of relations beyond the bounds of the thing in question. We begin this work today, right now, and we'll follow up with a series of public events at the end of April 2018, so stay tuned for that. It's with this goal in mind that I'm pleased to introduce tonight's, this afternoon's speakers, both of whom have a lot of experience wrestling with such questions in the context of renegotiating the relationship between mainstream museums and the indigenous peoples whose cultural patrimony they have long collected, preserved, and exhibited under largely Western scientific, aesthetic, and philosophical paradigms. Our first speaker on my left will be Jolene Rickard, artist, curator, and scholar of global indigenous aesthetics and visual sovereignty. She is Associate Professor in History of Art and Visual Studies and Director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program at Cornell University. She's also a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation. Our second speaker is Callie McHugh, Objects Conservator at the National Museum of the American Indian, where she has worked since 1996, when its collection was still in and around Manhattan. She specializes in the development of collaborative conservation practices for the care of Native American collections, and in fact the two worked together on some of the inaugural exhibits at NMAI. We'll hear from both in turn and then open it up for questions. Thank you. Jolene.
Just, oh, you're doing it. Okay. Okay. And she's going to put it on.
Yeah.
Okay. 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 Trat's gonna have. That's the traditional greeting of the Tuscarora people. It asks how you are this afternoon, if you're well, if you're in a state of peace. And I'd like to thank Erin for inviting me, as well as the Bard Center, for hosting this important discussion. I think a lot of the introduction that I thought I might start with has been covered, and so I'm going to skip to an observation that I'm making specifically about the Haudenosaunee and our relationship to these beings, objects, this list that Erin has outlined, including art. And so I'm asking the question how it is these things are collected, but I'm also looking at how these things are activated continuously within our own communities. And in this case, I wanted to introduce the idea of one dish, one spoon, which is the wampum belt on top, in conjunction with the same piece that's been most recently articulated by Babe and Carla Hemlock, both from the Kahnawake Mohawk community in 2014. Both pieces are meant to contribute to the idea of eating from one dish, which is a metaphor originally for hunting. And this entire region, which this part of the world was considered part of the Haudenosaunee Southern Door, the Haudenosaunee express themselves most often as the Eastern and Western Door. But more recently, this belt has reintroduced or has reinforced this idea of the Haudenosaunee also having relationships to a northern and southern border. And so the representation of this concept on the top with the abstract graphic is, I think, really this idea of sharing and sharing a hunting ground. And this particular wampum belt came into existence after a particularly violent period of history, just after the fur trade. And so the contemporary interpretation of this is based on the influence of trade and contact we see in the beadwork, but it also brings back this notion of this idea of the spoon. And the spoon is something that has also been this idea of taking from or sharing one territory, sharing the territory. And so the principles of peace, power, and righteousness, or this idea of that Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson now expresses as resurgence, and Alfred Tayage also expresses resurgence, is the path or trajectory of contemporary indigenous peoples. And so the Haudenosaunee are going through a period of resurgence. And so in contrast to this notion of sort of loss or victimization, the people themselves are in this mode of both rebuilding, continuing to reclaim, and resituating themselves in a continuous colonial state. And so the Haudenosaunee are sovereigntists and see themselves, or I should say see ourselves, as trying to deal with a deep ontology or relationship to place, while at the same time understanding and mediating our relationship to current conditions. And it's actually through this material that I think this is, in a way, kind of contemporary. It's a contemporary way in which the people are negotiating these spaces. The sort of organization of the culture is based on the formation of, or the continuous maintenance of, the creation story, and the creation story finds its way into a relationship to the prophetic movement of Ganonyok, or the Great Law, and the Great Law then is taken up in the visionary message of Handsome Lake, which is a post-contact 17 to 1800 message that is reinforced in the communities today. And so the Haudenosaunee imagine their world as three separate spaces, and the spaces include a time of beginning, present, and future, but they're all taking place at the same time. And that symbol is is this the pointer? Which part is the pointer here? Okay. And that symbol is most notably in the sky dome with this double curve motif. And often you'll see the representation of something growing, or this idea of the earth as established in this way. And so the fact that most indigenous peoples in the America think of the Americas as Turtle Island, this metaphor of the turtle, I think is something that is under consideration in many indigenous communities. In that right now, Amber Adams, Mohawk, also from the University of Buffalo, is looking at the specific reference of how plant species are occurring in the creation story. And so it's actually in the creation story that we see a number of these things, a number of the biome of this part of the world occur. And we see of the 40 plus different creation stories that have been documented, we see this shifting over time as far as like how they occur, why they occur, where they occur. Why this is important for us is that indigenous peoples are not the center of the world, but they're a part of a continuous relationship to place. And so this shift of thinking of oneself as at the height or the center is a profound difference. And how do we account for this in our evaluation of this material? And so the piece of the creation story that I want to share is the way in which it's visualized, what the visualization represents, what it represents philosophically. So we have the work of Scawanati on the left, She Falls for Ages. And then we have a daguerreotype of Carolyn Parker, who is Seneca, Scawanati's Mohawk. And in the corner of the skirt, there's the visual detail of the representation of this celestial tree. And so what the tree represents is it represents a seed. And so this notion of the plant or a seed coming from one place, space, point of time to this place, space, point in time is central in the way in which the Haudenosaunee understand their beginning or our beginning of time. And in Scawanate's version of this, she does employ a sort of technologized space as a way of trying to shift the primitivist construction of indigenous stories or presence to a contemporary perspective of the fact that these are observational practices that have been practiced for millennia by indigenous peoples, and these stories are vehicles for the translation of this, or the transmission or continuous the continuous transformation of this culture. And so in this case, Sky Woman is in the upper world and she's bringing life to this world. And so the double curve motif represents the whole or center of that moment of transformation or change. Scawanate represents it in this way.
Falls for ages. She falls for so long that she has time to scream, to cry, prey, to lose and regain her sanity, and finally to sleep. A flock of geese are soaring through the beautiful blue sky when they notice a strange creature, but it does not appear to be flying. As they get near, they see that it has neither wings nor fins, and that it is sleeping. They worry that this being will be hurt if it hits the water. Indeed, there is not yet any land on earth. Those helpful, kindly geese intercept Otsitsa-Gayam's fall. She is very grateful. She understands the geese's thoughts. They are trying to figure out what to do with her. They decide to ask the turtle if she can rest on his back.
And so the idea that the earth is alive is something that indigenous peoples anchor as a central idea in this philosophy. The idea that that the physical space of the earth existed, that human beings evolved into, is pretty consistent amongst indigenous stories in the Americas. The idea that life began with a woman, and that this is actually a metaphor for a vaginal birth, is part of the teaching that's embedded in this particular story. And so the fact that most indigenous thought is probably arrested at the 3rd or 4th grade level really doesn't permit us to get beyond this very reduced reading of the philosophy that's embedded in the metaphors in these stories. But it's actually this story, which is very old, considered to be one of the oldest beginning stories in the Americas, is something that has been taken up by artists throughout the Confederacy or the Haudenosaunee. One of the reasons that the figure of Sky Woman is really beginning to, I think, make her presence known again is because of the historic colonial record that's focused on the relationship of violence in contact, the war narratives, and the construction of the indigenous body as male and savage. All of these things are being deconstructed by artists in these communities with the focus on both women and women as life givers. And so I think that we look to contemporary artists in this way to understand these ideas. And so when I put forth this work, Corn Blue Room, which is a multimedia installation, I had a number of questions about what was going to happen to the corn. And the Denver Art Museum acquired this piece and has since deinstalled it, and the corn was distributed to soup houses in the Denver area, because I'm so confident that the Haudenosaunee will continue to grow this specific kind of white corn, and that we will maintain the knowledge to be able to continuously construct these braids, that I have no concern that at some point in the future, when a curator from Denver will call and say, we need 6 braids of corn to reinstall this piece, that it will still be present because of this issue of transmission. that this is a cultural priority, and we have to look at a key technology in the Americas of indigenous peoples is their continuous relationship to plants. And this is something that is done through the language, but it's also done through practice. And so we don't think of any of these traditions as static, but we think of them as constantly changing and evolving for each generation. And the way this is done is through language and through family relationships. And family relationships often described as kinship, but it's also through the process of naming. And so this is a piece that I did to demonstrate this sort of deep knowledge of naming. And so the Tuscarora were displaced from the Carolinas in the 1700s, and this piece takes my family back to the generation that would have been displaced from the Carolinas at that period of time. And so, wait a second.
Is it a video? Yeah,
Mia, Jolene, Lena, Sally, Florence, Helen, Harriet, Mary, Margaret, Yekisud Gehatneg, Margaret, Yekisud Gehatneg, Mary, Yekisud Gehatneg, Harriet, Yekisud Gehatneg, Helen, Uksud, Florence, Uksud, Sally, Uksud, Lena, Gadutrarit, Jolene, Yechenetti, Mia, Yerihuayetus.
And so each of the materials that are part of this installation are part of the migration story of the Tuscarora people. And so not only is it a piece that weaves in the generations of women, because we understand ourselves through the women's line. Some people refer to this as matrilineal. But it's also a close relationship to these materials that form this world. Oops. Thank you, Eric. And so part of the memory of continuity or place or growing is brought to us in this complex called the Three Sisters. And so I have a colleague, Jane Mont Pleasant, who has done extensive work on the biological intelligence of the Three Sisters. In Seneca, it's called Johenko, or the sustainers, they sustain us. And so I created a planting moon garden based on the visualization of the carapace of a turtle, and inside of this is using mound planting instead of row planting, which is a whole understanding about a different relationship to land and soil and use for it. And so in this case, I'm introducing the act of song as a way of having a relationship to these plants and growing. And so we have a series of planting songs that are meant to give instructions to the seeds to actually, or I should say, let me correct myself, what it's meant to do is confirm the instructions that the seeds have already been given. And so this idea that the knowledge is in the seed is consistent within this space. And so just going to stop that because I'm running short on time here. Okay. And then, why is that happening? What am I doing? I'm not a... Okay, and so this is the interim garden, and then this is the mature garden, the relationship between the corn, beans, and squash. And so they're actually, all of these seeds are actually ceremonial foods, as well as part of the creation story, the beginning story, and they also are referred to as part of the ceremonies. And so and so how do you maintain those relationships, I guess? Because I'm going a little long here, I think I'm going to leave this part of it, which is part of the curatorial effort that I worked on with Paul Chet-Smith at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I just want to move to the discussion of wampum. And so I see this as two systems. On the right-hand side, we see the treaties that were agreed to with both the federal governments of Canada and the United States, and also the trust relationship with the Crown or Great Britain. On the right-hand side, we see the Haudenosaunee agreements, which are the Wampum Belts. And so the whole question of wampum and repatriation is a big discussion in our communities. And when the Wampum Belts began to be repatriated from museums, the leaders in our community actually laid the wampum out on tables at the Onondaga Longhouse and asked the women to walk through and touch the wampum. And then we were asked to share any ideas or thoughts that we had the next day. And so the idea is that you could have had a dream where a memory or knowledge from the belts were expected to translate or come back through the act of touching it. And so in the beginning or creation story, there's a moment where the wampum is used to console a grieving man who's just lost his children, his daughters, to what's called blood wars or feuds. And the wampum is meant to take away this grief. And so recently, at the recitation of the Great Law, the wampum was recognized as a gift from the Creator. And it's interesting that this idea is something that has not been said publicly for a long time. And so there's a confidence or resurgence, one might argue, in how these belts function in our communities, because they've been discussed historically as mnemonic devices or devices of memory. But in fact, today people are seeing these wampum belts as actually having a much more profound role in the recovery of these memories through time. And this is a series of the belts that are displayed at this was the fourth recitation, this is the fourth rotation of the recitation of the Great Law. And so the Great Law is an oral recitation that takes approximately 10 days to recite. And it goes through and recalls a number of the pieces of knowledge in this belt. And so I wanted to share this one belt with you because it's meant to represent this consciousness of peace. It's called the wing or the dust. And through my work with a colleague at Cornell, we've identified some interesting correlations at the macular level in photography of these are, of course, really close photographs of magnification of the white pine. And so there is this sort of recovery now of knowledge in our communities where it's suggested that our people at one point in time really did or really saw themselves in relationship to, one might argue, the macular level of life, and that the interpretation of a number of the ideas that are carried forward in the metaphoric level of story actually are more connected to what the Hopi would argue as a web of life. And so there's a confidence in the communities at present to begin to articulate these ideas in this way, and at the same point in time to resituate how these ideas are discussed from a cultural perspective. And so I think that the work of Greg Stotts, who is also Mohawk, in his Dark String, which is a video feedback loop of one string of wampum in a digital feedback projector, is kind of emblematic of this idea of the reactivation of these traditional ideas in our communities, but with an understanding and not a fear, but an embrace of contemporary technology. And so this is just a video of Greg Stotts' Dark String. Okay, this is the last one. So you could see the string of wampum in the center there, and this goes on. It's I think a really kind of a beautiful piece, but it's this idea that the wampum is considered a light. That's what it actually means in the language. And this light, and so this is the idea, but it's meant to both console and broaden our minds. And so I guess my point today is just that I don't believe that we fully understand the knowledge that's embedded in indigenous cultures because this knowledge has been truncated by a primitivist notion of what these ideas are. But in fact, here are cultures globally that have lived in particular places for millennia, have been very carefully observing their relationship to that biome, and they've been then creating vessels or vehicles or cultural statements to move that knowledge forward. And so I think that there's a wonderful or profound opportunity to connect that with some of the thoughts that you're having today about our relationship to both time, place, and technology. Thank you.
There's a pointer if you need it.
Thank you.
So first, let me just, many thanks to Bard and many thanks to Aaron for the invitation to participate in this symposium. It's been fascinating and very much an honor to be here. It's also a real honor to be sitting in this same session with Jolene Rickard, who is a pretty phenomenal and amazing person. So I'll be honest, like many of you have said so far, I was kind of relieved to hear this, that this consideration of active matter kind of caused some head scratching, because it caused head scratching for me a little bit. I spent a good deal of time trying to kind of figure out what it meant and what it means in relation to what I do as a conservator at the National Museum of the American Indian. So many thanks to Aaron for providing kind of a larger contextual picture in his remarks, which really do help to situate my work. So as we know, conservators spend a good deal of time moving from the macro to the micro. And although the scope is widening, we are trained to focus on the materiality, on the materials. And the materiality really does sit at the core of the Western-trained conservator. So information we obtain from the material informs our treatment and care decisions. So as Aaron so eloquently described, this structure may not suffice in the care of indigenous collections. It can be argued that our training alone does not adequately prepare us to understand what is required for responsible stewardship of these belongings. What value systems or knowledge systems are necessary to construct a foundation in which informed decisions can be made? He made a critical point that indigenous value systems are inherently grounded in active relationships between materials and human makers, users, custodians, past, present, future, and to beings other than human. This fluidity between the animate and the inanimate, the past, present, and future, is essential for the understanding required for caring for these cultural items. It's also having the humility and the acceptance to know that in many ways we don't have the capacity to understand. Our expertly trained eyes, our analytical equipment, our Western-based education system simply cannot prepare us. Then how do we incorporate the knowledge systems essential for responsible care and treatment? So I've heard Jim Enote from Zuni say many times that museums have the opportunity to be places where different knowledge systems collide. So what I'm about to discuss is rooted in my experience as a non-native conservator working in an indigenous place for over 20 years. These are not my experiences alone, as I am a part of an incredible team of conservators, Marion Kamenetz, Susan Heald, Emily Kaplan, and Mountmaker Shelley Euler. Together, we've had the privilege of working with numerous postgraduate conservation and Mellon Fellows over many, many years. So Aaron mentions the relationships, and Jolene mentions relationships in their remarks. And indeed, relationships are at the foundation of this work. Conservators often start with their relationship to the object or to the tangible material and work outward. To describe the work we do at NMAI, it's necessary to start outward and move in. So you all might be familiar with the history of the National Museum of the American Indian, but I think it's significant to our discussion here. So this is George Gustav Heye, who created the Museum of the American Indian in 1916. His over 800,000 object collection served as quote-unquote evidence of people he believed whose very existence was threatened. The objects were paramount, and the desire was to freeze them in a particular place and time as determined by the museum. The Museum of the American Indian was a museum of its time, fitting in with other institutions like the American Museum of Natural History, the Penn Museum, the Peabody, the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. This is an image of the research branch where the collection was housed in the Bronx. So you can see these are really stored as things. These pieces are inaccessible and rendered static and disconnected. This disconnection was and is a form of control. This dynamic remained until the 1980s, when there was a convergence in the movement for cultural justice. Action stemmed from the work of Native American activists who were advocating for the return of their ancestors kept in museum collections and greater cultural authority and access to those collections. Their lobbying efforts influenced certain members of Congress and led to the passage of the American Indian Act in 1989. So this was the predecessor of the Native American Graves Repatriation Act and mandated that the Smithsonian acquire the Museum of the American Indian collection, which had gone up for sale due to the bankruptcy of the Heye Foundation. So it really is in this action or activism that the National Museum of the American Indian was created, and with this mission statement. And the mission statement is very important to the work we do at the National Museum of the American Indian because it stresses that this work that the museum undertakes will be done through partnership with Native people and others, and that it works to support the continuance of culture. And it really looks at the work or the activities of the museum as past, present, and future. So what I find really interesting about this is that while nothing in the collection changed, none of those 800,000 objects changed, the relationship of the museum and its staff to the collection was changed forever. And I like to pretend that that happened in an instant with the signing of the papers, but obviously it didn't happen in an instant. But for Native people, those cultural belongings were always connected, they were always alive, they were always part of their communities, but it took this legislation from Congress to convince the rest of us that this is what this museum would now represent. It would become a Native place. So how that happens on a daily basis is still an experiment, and it is still a bumpy road. We're still trying to really figure out what this looks like. So I'm going to focus on the Cultural Resources Center. I think it's really important to start with the infrastructure, because the infrastructure of place is really important. So this is where the collection is housed. It's a non-public building. It was built to really be a home for the collection, and you can see it's quite a stunning structure. It was built with embedded principles important to Native people throughout the Western Hemisphere. So the collection sits at the center of the building, and the activity and action spirals around it like a nautilus. And that spiral shape or nautilus shape is an important shape to people throughout the Western Hemisphere. The building faces an easterly direction, which is important. When you walk in, you see the rotunda there. The woods on the floor are from the southern part of the hemisphere. The woods on the column are from the north. There's cedar. There are portals from the underworld, the living world, and to the upper world. There's an elder's bridge that takes you out to an outdoor ceremonial space and an indoor ceremonial space where burning can happen on a moment's notice. So what does this look like? I think it's important to also say that the collections are housed in one space, and that the communities are located geographically. So the northern communities are in the north, the southern communities are in the south. And there are windows in our collection space, and it was important to people that their belongings be able to see what season it is, and to be able to tell if it's night or day. So I bring this up because as someone working to take care of a collection like this, those principles or that connectedness to something bigger hits you the minute you walk in the front doors of this building. So I'm just going to really focus on what does working in a living culture museum look like for conservators. So by extension, we have to think of the collection as living if this is a living culture museum. So we're a profession dedicated to preservation, but as we've mentioned here, really the preservation of what? There's been a great deal of discussion in our field over the last 20 years of preserving the intangible in addition to the tangible, but as we've already heard, Indigenous people don't see those things as separate. What I can offer today is a glimpse of what this convergence looks like in practice, or I should say the attempt at this convergence. What this looks like in practice, it is the realization that there are different platforms of understanding, and for me, reconciling where the one that represents my profession fits into this. What became clear very early on is that I was not entirely qualified to do my job. I didn't possess critical knowledge that resides in Native nations. It was evident to me that responsible stewardship would require partnership or collaboration at the very least. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through some examples of kind of different projects or different work that's happened that we've done. We don't have a lot of time, so I was thinking maybe it would be good to kind of go in depth in one case study, and I thought, no, you know what? It'll show the diversity and the complexity of kind of what we have the opportunity to do at the Cultural Resources Center. So the first, and Erin can actually tell you all about this, but I'm going to focus on, this is a project that was part of the Listening to Our Ancestors exhibition, and I will say that our work as conservators at NMAI is really exhibit driven. We support 2 exhibition facilities, one in New York and one in Washington, D.C., so we spend the majority of our time preparing these cultural items for exhibition and working with our curators and working with Native communities in order to most responsibly do that. So this was an exhibition that opened in 2007. What we're seeing here is a raven Hamsa mask. The community curators from the Kwakwaka'wakw really wanted to include this mask. It is from a known carver, Mungo Martin, who was a very important carver in the Kwakwaka'wakw community. Carvers were really responsible for keeping the culture alive when a lot of the ceremonies and potlatches were illegal for a long period of time. So they really did risk their lives carving these masks to kind of keep the culture going. What was very troubling to the community curators is that you can see on the mask it has this kind of really ratty muslin trailer and kind of a yarn and eagle feather top portion, which was very heavily damaged. The mask would have had a cedar bark trailer like the one you see just below it. And we don't have museum records. We don't have any records that really accompany this piece. So we don't know what exactly happened. We don't know that this wasn't the original trailer. But what we do know is that from our Kwakwaka'wakw curators is that this piece, the red cedar bark, is an essential cultural component of this mask, and that in order to dance it, it hides the dancer. And that's significant because the dancer isn't a person. The dancer becomes this being, and the being is this man-eating ravens mask. So they wanted to replace the trailer with a new red cedar bark one to essentially renew the mask, which is something that would be done constantly in the community. So that decision came down from the community. The museum, the deadline was really pretty quick. So our reaction was, okay, put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to be a living culture museum, you have to accept change and evolution, and that these are not static items, that these pieces are belongings that are connected to these communities. And so the trailer was made in the community and sent down with carver Kevin Kramer, and then was replaced in the conservation lab. And the role of the conservator at that point became one of documentation. We've talked a lot about documentation. Of course, in our neuroses, we collected every single bit and item that came off the mask, and it's contained and is kept with the mask itself. But you can see that the proper protocols in this were also done. So Kevin sang a song for the renewed mask, and then you can see it on exhibition there on the left, and it is a very different piece. The next is, I think it's interesting because Jolene talked about continuous relationship to place. So this is really an example of this continuity or this fluidity between past, present, and future through the material of copper. So on the right is artist Michael Belmore. He's Anishinaabe, and on the left is his piece entitled Shorelines, which actually consists of two really huge 10 by 6 foot panels of copper that he has chased to form the outlines of North America, the shorelines of North America. So this piece was selected for an exhibition called Before and After the Horizon, which was at our New York facility in 2013. And in addition to that, the curators also selected several of these copper blades that date to 4,000, they're approximately 4,000 years old. And he asked me, Kelly, hey, will you go in and just take a look at these blades, make sure they're stable for exhibition? And I said, sure. So I go in collections and I look at them. And on my way out, Michael Belmore's piece is actually situated right by the door that goes out to the conservation lab. And I knew his piece Shorelines was also selected for the exhibition, and it just really hit me. I was like, my God, the Anishinaabe have been using copper for over 4,000 years. And copper, and native copper, is integral to the Great Lakes region, and it's integral to these people. And so I nervously called Michael Belmore and said, I could do an interview with you, and I could talk to you about the care of your piece in our collection, but would you be willing to come and maybe do like a workshop with us and kind of explore this idea of copper and its use for thousands of years? And he must have had experience with conservators, because he said, man, I'd love to hang out with you nerds for 2 days. I mean, he didn't say it like that. He didn't call us nerds, but he knew, he was well aware of what he was going to be getting into. So he did have the willingness to come, and before he came, we did XRF analysis on the blades to kind of assess their level of purity, because there were some pieces that there was some suspicion that were fakes, actually. So in working with him, it was pretty incredible to have his very educated eyes on these pieces to kind of talk about working process. we did have this incredible kind of hands-on component to this where we were hammering and annealing copper. We were talking about how copper is, an inorganic material. However, it's not static. It's constantly moving. And that was something that was really, I think, important for us to understand as conservators, because I looked at Michael Belmore's pieces, the 10x6 copper panels, and initially I was like, oh, those are really interesting. This is really great, and it's talking about resource extraction. It's talking about all these really important points. But what I didn't realize is how incredibly hard it was to do what he did with those panels. Copper moves, and it's really malleable. So in order to achieve the level of control he did on those pieces was pretty astounding. And we only really experienced that through the action of doing. So again, I think I take what Jim Enote says very seriously, that we do have the opportunity to be places where knowledge systems collide. And so we had an archaeologist, and we had the curator, and we had Michael as an artist. We had metalsmiths, conservators, everybody there kind of putting our breast minds together to kind of document and understand the pieces in our collection. So lastly, I just want to talk about these incredible Tlingit spruce root baskets. And again, Jolene mentions a continuous relationship to plants, and this is a very important and good example of that. So this is Terry Rothgar. Unfortunately, we lost Terry last year to cancer. She was an important partner to us in conservation, and she was a material scientist, I'm going to say. She was a person when let me just see if I can show you. So we have about 500 Tlingit baskets, spruce root baskets in our collection. About 180 of them have this really horrible glue and tape repair method that happened post-collection. So that's an indication that these baskets tear. So that's one of the questions that we had is, what is it about spruce root that kind of causes this pervasive tearing? And, you don't want to judge, but this was a very unfortunate repair method because it's causing damage in itself. So a lot of times high glue was used, so it is shrinking and it's pulling the material, causing more damage. So we contacted Terry as a Tlingit weaver to kind of really talk about, some of this understanding. What do we need to understand about the baskets? What's important? And she said, God, thank God you called. She said, I've been working with museums for years and they always call me to talk about something spiritual. That's all we have to offer is something spiritual. She said, what about our technical understanding? She's like, I really want to find the intersection between indigenous science and Western science. I want access to your tools, to your analytical equipment. She's like, I have a lot of questions that I need answered. So we were just like, okay, let's go, So Terry came and conducted this workshop, but one thing she said is, she's like, if you're going to take care of these, she's like, you need to understand how they're made. You need to understand where they come from. You need to understand their place. So we started with the Sitka spruce, and she said, I'm going to send you some spruce roots, and we're going to roast them, and we're going to remove the bark, and we're going to split them, and you all are going to weave, and you're going to understand what this is like. So we received an email from her, and she's like, I'm really sorry the delay in getting the roots to you. She goes, I know you guys need to freeze them because of your bug issue. She's like, but I ran into some obstacles. And we were like, oh, no, no problem. And she's like, there's a beached dead whale on the shores of the island that I go to collect the roots. And we were like, oh, right, the whale, And she goes, no, it's not the whale, it's the grizzly bears that are eating the whale. She said, I do not want to risk my life for you all. So she said, and we laughed and we were like, that's like Alaskan bureaucracy right there, So, but you can see the Sitka spruce grows everywhere in Sitka, but why have Tlingit women traveled for thousands of years to this one particular place to collect spruce roots? It's because the nature of the soil. The sand allows these trees to grow straighter and their roots to go straighter. So you want straight roots when you're making baskets because it is more efficient in your weaving. So Terry talked a lot about the science embedded in weaving as a binary system. She talked about, so we did get the roots, And we did go out to that outdoor ceremonial area that I showed you, and we roasted the roots, and we used the traditional ina to remove the bark. But what was really interesting is I asked her, Terry, so does the roasting just allow you to remove the bark more easily? And she said, no, actually it does that. She goes, but it's also prevents fungal growth. And she said, women have known these things for, again, thousands of years. So we did do, it was the genius idea of our Mellon fellow who was working on this project at the time, Lou Benner. She's like, okay, well, let's take samples along the course of the processing to really look at a cellular level, what's happening, what is being removed in the bark removal process, where do we see weakness in the cellular structure as we manufacture these pieces. The other thing to really keep in mind is, we oftentimes, I find that in conservation, we start with the objects in our lab, and we don't really think about where they come from, and we don't really think about the plants and the structure of the plants, but these are roots. I mean, they're used to being wet. They transport nutrients and materials. So when you have a basket that's 150 years old that hasn't been wet, that's been sitting on the shelves in the museum, that material becomes dry and brittle and prone to tearing, So I think there is a lot of potential for work in this area to kind of connect some of these principles. So one other thing Terry said is, okay, if we're going to do this, I want you to invite all the conservators that have Tlingit basket collections, because I really only want to say this once. And I really thought that was also really funny, because in our quest to characterize or departmentalize everything, we do that with our own collections. We're the Museum of the American Indian. We're not the National Museum of Natural History. We're not American Museum of Natural History. But the way that Tlingit look at it, it's like all of you have our stuff, And so we had an incredible session. The work with her continued over 7 years. I'm just showing you the start. We actually traveled out to Alaska to really get a more intimate sense of place. So I'm going to stop there. There's like 1,000 other things I could show you all, but I'm not going to. But just in conclusion, I think I was kind of talking with Erin and Jolene about this, is that I feel like in my time at NMAI, I've had to do a lot of unlearning. And I say that because I think that we are still really trained in a very Western-focused way, even with our best attempts to say that we are, moving forward. This symposium gives me great hope. I think there is a lot of potential moving forward. I think we have a lot to learn from Indigenous people, and I think because their knowledge systems and their way of thinking are already integrated. So that's something that I've really experienced over my 20 years there, and I think I'm just starting to scratch that surface of understanding. So I guess for this working group, I would say to all of you, I think there's a lot for this group to offer. So thank you.
We've also been talking about the fact that it's impossible to bracket off the indigenous ontology's concerns from material science, history, and philosophy, as I think these presentations, it's a kind of umbrella category in which all of the others play. We're really out of time, and we're ready for a coffee break. If there are a couple pressing questions that people need to sort of get off now before we take a break, and then can hopefully come back to things in general discussion later on.
I just want to say thank you. That was amazing.
Thanks for listening.
One question in the behind.
I hesitate to ask this, and it's not totally formulated, but it's so interesting to hear this history of the Museum of the American Indian. And I'm trying to think about other efforts of cultures that have committed genocide and their attempts to conserve the culture of the people who were affected, a weak word for that experience. So, there's the German Holocaust Museum in Berlin there. And I just wonder, do you think of it that way? Do you communicate with those other museums? I don't know what, there you could think of other examples that are not museums. So I'm just wondering if you have any comment.
Well, I mean, what I will say is I felt totally unprepared, honestly, to do this work, because we're so material focused, right? We're so fixated on materials that I felt like God, I could really use some like conflict resolution training or larger, broader social science training that I didn't get. And so I really honestly credit the patient partners we've had in our community, our Native Indigenous partners, because the level of patience they've shown with us is pretty astounding. I mean, the tolerance, and I think it's through those relationships. So we haven't contacted other institutions, like you're saying, or other people who have worked with communities who have suffered genocide, but I think that's because I rely so heavily on our Indigenous partners for that guidance. So we talk a lot about authority and who has authority, and it is not hard for me at all to relinquish my authority. I know where the expertise and where the authority resides.
Okay. I'd like to respond, because I don't think it's just a museum issue. I think it's a societal issue in the settler state of North America, in that America has yet to come to terms with its relationship, its formation with our dispossession. And so the section that I skipped over, we created something, Paul Chet-Smith and I, for the inaugural opening, created something called, what we called the colonization machine, which was guns, Bibles, and treaties. And we saw the assemblage of this material as evidence of this capture. And yet at the same time, we were trying to use this material as evidence also of our the accomplishments of indigenous peoples for millennia in this continent. And so I think that until America understands its relationship to indigenous peoples, I do think that it will not understand itself. And so this is, it's a much broader question, I think, a really important question.
I think, too, just to close, I think the question about the shift at NMAI and in a larger set of institutions, and this is relevant to this larger project, is a shift in thinking, in moving away from thinking about these collections as repositories of the past, which is what the issue of conservation is predicated on, and thinking about them as repositories for a future, for an indigenous future. And it shifts the kinds of notions of temporality that we have to think about and when we think about the work of conservation.
Right. Yeah.
The kinds of temporality we're going to think about right now is a coffee break.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.